Thank you for joining us this evening for this especially important lecture. This is the last in the first season of the Water Talk series at ISER Pune. We have a Center for Water Research established last semester. And through this center, we are trying to get people who are talking and practicing about water in different disciplines and in different spaces, to get them to speak and introduce issues, to resolve queries, to also demystify water for people who understand water differently. So today we have with us Dr. Jagdish Ramaswamy, and I invite him. But before I do that, I just wanted to explain, I put in on the chat room a few rules, just the, housekeeping things, that please keep yourself, keep your audio and video off, so that we can have an uninterrupted live stream on YouTube, and also have an, fairly good refined recording to be uploaded later on for our channel. Also, if you're asking a question, please do mark question before it so that it is easy for me to spot and, present it to Jagdish when the round comes. The format of this talk would be, we will have a few minutes for the introduction to the speaker, and then we'll have 40 to 45 minutes for the main lecture. We will open the floor for questions for 15 to 20 minutes post the lecture, and then we will have concluding remarks. So before we proceed, I would like to invite my colleague from Department of Biology, Dr. Deepak Barua, to please do give an introduction to our speaker of the day. He knows the work and he knows the person very intimately, so we thought that who else but Deepak could provide an introduction to this special talk. So do stay with us. Thank you, Deepak. Please take on the floor.
Thanks a lot, Shalini. It's a great pleasure to introduce Jagdish Krishnawamy. Shalini, I'm not sure I would qualify as knowing Jagdish intimately, but I think well enough, right, Jagdish? Yeah, so Jagdish did his BTech from IIT Mumbai in civil engineering. He did a master's degree in statistics and then a PhD in environmental studies from Duke University. His academic research focuses on eco-hydrology and landscape level ecology. But in addition to his academic research and work, Jagdish is very actively involved in also conservation planning. Jagdish is a regular contributor to the IPCC meetings and a lead author on some of the IPCC publications. He's also very actively involved in the Indian context, working with the Ministry of Environmental Sciences in putting together policy decisions for how India should tackle, mitigate, adapt to climate change. So without much more ado, I invite Jagdish to go ahead and tell us more about water security in India.
Thanks, Deepak, and thanks, Shalini, thanks, Sarah, thanks, Bijoy, Pushkar, all the friends and colleagues for making this possible. So I just want to make sure I'm audible. And if there's a yes, then I'll go ahead.
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Okay, great. So today, my focus is going to be certain aspects of the linkages between ecology and water security. And I will be trying to dwell on some lesser known phenomena and processes that we probably need to learn about, and some that we may have already known about from before, which are available in the as paradigms or in the popular discourse. I will spend less time on. So I'm trying to change my slide, and let's see if that happens. So that's one thing. Okay. Has the slide changed?
Yes.
Okay, great. So just to give you a brief outline of what are the different components that try to cover. The first few minutes, I'm going to talk on the role that forests and vegetation plays in the hydrologic cycle, hydrological regulation. Then I'll spend quite a bit of time talking about new insights that we have gained about forests and rainfall in India, in terms of how forests are impacting rainfall. We all know that rainfall obviously impacts vegetation. So that part is very well established, and we know that certain types of forests, like evergreen forests, grow in places where there's more rainfall compared to other places where there is less rainfall, and you may have deciduous forests or scrub forests and semi-arid ecosystems. But here I'll spend a little bit of time of some of the emerging evidence from work done by Indian scientists, not very far from Pune, and including in Pune and elsewhere, Mumbai, as well as some foreign scientists who looked at the impact of natural vegetation in India on the rainfall itself, which could be changing many paradigms about ecosystem services. A little bit about ecosystems and how they may help mitigate climate change and disasters. Some of the aspects we need to keep in mind when we have to embark on ecological restoration in India, because we have some very ambitious targets set for example, for restoring 26 million hectares. We have a Green India mission, which seeks to afforest or reforest 10 million hectares. Something on how we need to manage our rivers, and some solutions and policy directions in the end. So I'm going to start from the basics. This is a schematic of the water balance for any ecosystem. And so that tree there, which is receiving the rainfall P, is just a symbol for natural vegetation. Of course, in this case, it's trees, but it could also very well be grasses, or it could be a combination of grass and trees and shrubs and so on. So you have input rainfall, and some of that rainfall falls on the leaves and branches, and it evaporates directly before reaching the ground. So that's known as interception. And so that's the part of evaporation, direct evaporation. Some of the rainfall will trickle down through the foliage and land up on the soil, and then could evaporate directly. So that will add to the direct evaporation from leaves and branches. And so that's again adds to the evaporation part. Now, as it continues to rain, some of the moisture which has fallen through the vegetation as well as directly on the soil will then infiltrate into the soil, and it will start building up soil moisture. It will then reach the rooting depth of the vegetation, and this may vary depending on the type of ecosystem you have and the type of plants you have. And then over a period of time, some of that soil moisture which has got added by the rainfall event will get absorbed through the roots of the trees, and then contributes to a process called transpiration, which is part of photosynthesis. So whenever you have photosynthesis, you also have transpiration. That is, they go hand in hand. So that is the transpiration and evaporation together are known as evapotranspiration. And that is a function of the structure and composition of the vegetation that you have. It differs from one place to another. What percentage of the rainfall gets converted into evapotranspiration is a function of the vegetation type. Now, we have reached up to the soil moisture at the rooting depth. Now, some of that moisture will escape beyond the rooting depth, and it will contribute to what is known as drainage. So that is the basically your groundwater. Now, that groundwater can flow downstream, and it can end up in a stream or a wetland or a lake or a pond. It could become what is known as the base flow of a stream. Now, the part of rainfall that does not contribute to any of these, but instead falls on the surface of the soil and goes directly as runoff, because either because the soil is not able to absorb the rate at which rainfall is falling. And so it's known as infiltration excess runoff, and that is known as direct runoff. Now that direct runoff and the contribution of subsurface and base flow from the deep drainage, that is what you end up seeing in a stream or a river coming out of a vegetated catchment. So then you have this water balance where the precipitation P is equal to the evapotranspiration plus a runoff. Plus you see the DS term, that's the change in storage. Because whenever you start counting all your different components of the water balance, we didn't start from a zero moisture system, right? There would always be some moisture stored in the system. It could be in the soil, it could be in the wetlands or ponds or whatever. And so that's why you have a delta S term, which is basically the change in storage. And then you have that deep drainage. So that completes your water balance equation. And on the right-hand side, I just want to point out that transpiration itself is a very active process. And it can be shut by the plant or the tree, depending on what is known as the water potential, which is basically in some sense, the thermodynamic status of the water in the soil. So if that water is really difficult to get at, so basically if the plant roots have to do a lot of work to gain that water, then it's a negative water potential. So that's basically how tough is it for a plant root to absorb that moisture. So if it's like small molecules of water trapped between clay particles and that's what is left, now that water will have a very negative water potential compared to a more saturated, subsaturated condition where it's very easy for the water to be absorbed by the roots. And if the plant feels there is a negative water potential, that means there's going to be potential moisture stress, then it can shut down photosynthesis so that the transport of water from the roots to the foliage can be stopped. And the reason why this has to happen is that if you actually have a break in the water column, or if you have a demand for water from the foliage on top, even though there isn't sufficient moisture to meet that demand from the soil and through the roots, you could cause serious damage to the tissues of the plants through embolism and cavitation, and that can actually kill many plant cells, and it can damage the plant, and in some cases it can even kill the shrub, tree, or so. So that's basically your, in some sense, the 101 of your water balance and the water cycle with respect to an individual vegetated ecosystem. So now we talked about this evapotranspiration, and now it's a big function, it's a major function of the rainfalls, as you can see. So what we have here on the y-axis is annual evapotranspiration, and on the x-axis you have annual rainfall. And then you can see two different lines. But there's a dotted line, which is basically grassland or grass-dominated ecosystems, and then you have another line on top, which is basically your forest-dominated systems. So you can see that as you increase the rainfall, that is, different parts of the world get different amounts of rainfall, or even say in India, let's say that we move away from the Western Ghats into the Deccan Plateau, you will obviously have a reduction in rainfall. And if you move from the Deccan Plateau into the Western Ghats, you might actually have an increase in rainfall. Now, depending on the rainfall, the amount of rainfall that is converted into evapotranspiration changes. And you can see that the gap between grassland and forest widens as the rainfall increases. So you can see that using the rainfall, and I can make a prediction that if I plant trees, for example, on grassland, how much of additional evapotranspiration am I going to have at a given amount of rainfall? So this is this is based on experimental evidence from different instrumented catchments from around the world. So it's a pretty robust relationship, which you can use as a ready reckoner for trying to predict the impact of converting, let's say, a tree-dominated system into a grass-dominated system, or the effect of planting trees on grassland. So this is just to show that evapotranspiration is a very important outcome of land cover change. So these are two ecosystems from the Western Ghats, Southern Western Ghats. I took these pictures in different elevations of Erevikulam National Park. On the left-hand side, you have mid-elevation evergreen forest. And on the right-hand side, you have high-elevation grassland. And you can see that there is perennial water. This is in the same time of the year, in the dry season. There's perennial water coming out of both types of ecosystems. But you will, based on the graph that we just saw, you will predict that as a percentage of the precipitation, the ecosystem on the right-hand side, which is the grassland, is going to have a much lower evapotranspiration compared to the one on the left-hand side. So that's so we're not talking about converting any of these to each other, but just to just illustrate that, because there's something called leaf area index, which is the area of leaves, all the leaves above a ground in a certain area. So I just need to go back to the previous slide. And so if you take a multi-tiered forest, if you add up all the surface area of all the leaves above a unit area on the ground, it is got all these multiple layers. So you end up with a very high, what is known as the leaf area index. And whereas on the right-hand side, the grassland, grasses, they have a much lower, there's no multi-structure here. And they also have shallower roots in general compared to trees. So their ability to tap very deep groundwater and so on is limited compared to deep-rooted trees. In India, we have a diversity of forest types, from evergreen forests to semi-arid ecosystems. And so that's, and we have, two global biodiversity hotspots, but we do have these clusters of forests which are a little bit more dominated, for example, the central Indian highlands, the Western Ghats, the northeastern region, the Western Himalayas. So there, and then the certain parts of the Eastern Ghats where you have more contiguous patches of forests, and we'll come to that, what role they may be playing. So if you look at the paradigm of how the dry season stream flow can respond to changes in forest cover or tree cover, there are three different outcomes that have emerged in the last 150 years of hydrology, eco-hydrology. So in the beginning, the sponge effect was the dominant paradigm. That is, if you have more forest cover, then whatever rainfall is falling on the forest is absorbed and then released slowly in the dry season, and therefore you get perennial streams. And that paradigm and that hypothesis, that process phenomena basically predicts that as you increase forest cover, you should see more dry season stream flow. That is water flowing in the stream for a longer time in the dry season, or more amount of water flowing in the dry season as a function of forest cover. So you can see that it's a positive relationship. And you know that foresters and conservationists have often been referring to the sponge effect as an important paradigm. I just need to get rid of one font, just one second. Sorry about that. So that was the first paradigm. The second paradigm is that you see the lowermost line, which is basically that evapotranspiration increases as you increase tree cover, tree density, or forest cover. And that part dominates. So you can see these two types of arrows. You can see one arrow going into the ground. That is basically your infiltration and recharge of groundwater. And then you have an arrow going up from the vegetation, which is basically your evapotranspiration. Now, you can see that whenever in the sponge effect, the dominant arrow is the infiltration and recharge of groundwater, and the arrow which represents evapotranspiration is much weaker. Therefore, that's why the net effect is an increase in dry season stream flow as you increase the tree density or forest cover. Now, in the lowermost line, you can see that the evapotranspiration is the dominant response as the forest cover increases, and the infiltration and recharge of groundwater is the weaker one. When that happens, you actually have, as forest cover or tree density increases, you actually have a decrease in dry season stream flow. And then in between, you have a situation where these two processes can roughly balance each other out in terms of magnitude. And so when that happens, you actually have a neutral response to changes in tree density or forest cover. Now, all of these paradigms evidence has been found for a long time. The evapotranspiration, very sanitized experimental catchment work from many parts of the world, especially in the West. But then more recently, evidence for the sponge effect and the neutral effects are emerging. So this is basically, whether it's from Costa Rica or whether from the Western Ghats, we are seeing the sponge effect and neutral effects, as well as in other places you have the evapotranspiration paradigm dominating. And there's also, this is a function of the age of the trees. It's a function of the species of the trees. It is also a function of what the soil conditions and geology are. So even though this is a nice schematic conceptual diagram, it's not going to be very as neat as this in the real world. From the data is actually going to be very noisy, but nevertheless, this sort of captures the essence of what the existing hypotheses are in ecohydrology. So just to give an example, our own instrumented catchment work from the Western Ghats was leaning towards the sponge effect, and relatively, in areas which are getting about 3,000 to 3,000 millimeters, 3,500 millimeters of rainfall a year, where you have remnant natural for evergreen forest, you have degraded forests, you have acacia plantations. When we established instrumentation and compared, and we did all the modeling and measurements, we ended up finding that there was very high infiltration rates on the natural forests. The recharge to groundwater was pretty good, and there was perennial stream flow coming out of even the well-forested natural forests. And so the trade-off was now more with respect to the infiltration and recharge rather than the transpiration. So now the question arises that, yes, we do recognize that evapotranspiration can be a problem. For example, when you convert grassland into a tree plantation, you're going to increase the evapotranspiration tremendously, and you might end up having less water flowing in the stream and less hydrologic services or ecosystem services coming out of whatever whoever was dependent on that flowing water. However, now let's look at that evapotranspiration itself. Is it a loss from the ecosystem? Is it something that doesn't play any role? We all know that any water that gets evaporated, whether it's coming from a plant or whether it's coming from a water body such as a lake, ends up in the atmosphere. And so it's anything that comes through plants is known as the green water flux. So that's basically, and anything that flows in streams and contributes to surface water bodies or flows as groundwater flow, that's known as blue water flux. So this green water flux goes up into the atmosphere, and some of that gets recycled back as rainfall. So that is where, now that happens at a very different spatial scale than the scale at which the trade-off that we talked about in the earlier examples happens. So at some scale, you have evapotranspiration, which could end up reducing stream flow if it increases because of increases in tree density and so on. But at other spatial scales, it actually will be pumping lots of moisture into the atmosphere, some of which is going to get recycled as rainfall, except that it's going to get distributed over a much larger area. So it's not going to waste. It's going up and coming back in different ways. Now, until very recently, most of the evidence on how the evapotranspiration from forests contributes to rainfall was this paradigm was basically confined to large stretches of forest, such as the Amazonian rainforests in Brazil, in South America, parts of the Congo Basin, and so on. So basically, that paradigm was never investigated in some other parts of the world, especially in India, where you have much smaller patches of forests, much smaller than anything close to the Amazon or Congo, or for that matter, even some of the Southeast Asian forests. But we do have patches which are reasonable, like the Western Ghats, it's a long stretch of forests. We have the Central Indian Highlands. We have some parts of, we have Northeastern India, we have Western Himalayas, we have some parts of the Eastern Ghats, which are reasonably large patches. Now, when modelers started getting better with the spatial resolution of their input data and with the models themselves, it turns out that some other parts of the world also, the evapotranspiration from forests is getting recycled back as rainfall. So for example, this paper by Spracklen et al. 2012 of how tropical rainfall, which passes over, whenever you have air which is passing over forests, it gets moistened. And so areas which are downstream of the forest receive that bounty. And so you can see that even in this global study, India is parts of India are shown in the significant contributors to this contribution of evapotranspiration to rainfall. So this was one of the first few studies that explicitly showed parts of India as being part of this phenomenon. Then more studies have followed, and this study by Green et al., for example, shows that these hotspot for precipitation vegetation, these vegetation precipitation feedbacks, they can explain sometimes up to 30% of the observed precipitation variance, and they are concentrated in grasslands and savannas, transitional zones, subhumid zones, such as monsoonal regions. And the bulk of India's patches of forests are actually, and savanna woodlands, they are in this category. So this is another study which also showed significance of recycling of evapotranspiration from forests in India which is significant at a global scale. When you look at but I just want to point out that when you have models which are run for the entire globe, their spatial resolution and in terms of misalignment there can be an issue. So when you zoom into, for example, which parts of India are contributing, you should take it with it could be, the southern Western Ghats may not end up showing as much, or the Central Indian Highlands might not actually fall in the stippled region. So for example, the stippled region here denotes areas where air exposed to vegetation has twice or more moisture than air not exposed to vegetation. So if you have an air mass passing over the Central Indian Highlands, it will gain twice or more moisture compared to an air parcel which moves over deforested land. So that's basically, and you can see that parts of India are very much part of this phenomenon. So if you look at, for example, the Western Ghats, it's a big pump takes out a lot of moisture from the soils and groundwater and pumps it into the atmosphere. You can see that many of you who have traveled in the Western Ghats, we have anywhere between 3 to 5 months of dry season, and yet many of these areas still retain fairly evergreen characteristics. So the evapotranspiration is active even during the dry season. So that's something. And so this is just an estimate of the amount of green water flux in millimeters per year from different parts of the Western Ghats. This is something that we did some years back. So you can see that the Western Ghats is a very significant contributor of the green water flux. And when you started having folks looking at this phenomena within India, so you have scientists from IIT Mumbai, for example, where they actually found that this moisture supply from the Western Ghats forests is actually contributing to rainfall in water deficit east coast of India, especially in Tamil Nadu. So now this whole Karnataka, Tamil Nadu controversy over the Kaveri and so on has got a new dimension. You actually have a connection between the ecological security of the Western Ghats and the water security of people in Tamil Nadu, which is which bypasses the river flow system. So it's a very different way. Okay, so then here's some other examples. This is from Nepal, but applies to many parts of the Himalayas, where they found that the evapotranspiration from local vegetation varies from 0.5 to 6 millimeters per day, which is quite significant. And 15 to 35% of the moisture from local ecosystems comes back as rainfall. So it's an internal recycling which happens. And this mechanism persists even when the local areas are delinked or isolated from the monsoon flow, which means that you might have 1 week or 3 or 4 days or 2 days or 3 days where that particular area is delinked from the regional monsoon wind systems, and yet this local recycling of that moisture contributes to rainfall there. So this is an evidence. So we saw evidence on the Western Ghats. Here is some evidence from the Himalayas, even though this particular study was done in Nepal. And there was some more recent work, again, done by a combination of folks, including from IIT Mumbai, where actually they found that this linkage between the leaf area index and evapotranspiration and rainfall and so on, this is very significant in some regions during drought years. That means this linkage between vegetation feedback to the monsoon becomes more important during a drought year compared to a surplus year. So that is something that has emerged. Now, the other part, a role that forests play is, you have this evapotranspiration, which is going into the atmosphere, but you also have lots of other stuff going into the atmosphere. You have aerosols from both anthropogenic as well as natural sources, including from the forests themselves. Now, the atmospheric aerosols are potential cloud condensation nuclei. And so when you have evapotranspiration from forests, such as in the Himalayas or the Western Ghats, interacting with aerosols, whether natural or anthropogenic, you have a process where there is a higher probability of rainfall occurring because of the formation of cloud condensation nuclei. So this is another role that forests, and the evidence from India is limited, but it's emerging. So this is some of the work that I was able to find, where they looked at aerosol cloud condensation nuclei in Eastern Himalayas. And similarly, there are one study where in the Western Ghats also it has been shown in one particular spot. So this is again another role played by the combination of natural and anthropogenic aerosols interacting with the evapotranspiration contributed by forests, and then therefore contributing to local and regional rainfall dynamics. Now, we are now shifting from the role that forests play in influencing rainfall, and we also earlier looked at the role that forests play and tree cover plays in influencing the local hydrologic cycle. We now look at much of the water that flows in our rivers. So this is the other dimension of how the water flowing in streams and rivers contributes to ecological security. So earlier you had ecosystems contributing to water security. Now you have water which is enriching these ecosystems. I've shown different examples of riparian ecosystems. Now you can see that if you go to any riparian forest in India, you will sometimes find some very large trees located in the riparian stretch. So these riparian areas are actually local hotspots of carbon in the system regionally. They are also very important for biodiversity and for many other ecosystem services, including non-timber forest products. Many other processes happen in the floodplain and valleys and in this riparian zone. So this interaction of flowing water and response of vegetation to that is another dimension of the ecological security that I wanted to dwell upon, because this contributes to fisheries, it contributes to biodiversity conservation, it contributes to tourism, aesthetics, many other things. Now we're talking about water flowing in streams, and one of the most important paradigms in what maintains the productivity of a stream or a river is what is known as the flood pulse paradigm or concept. So the flood pulse is basically suggesting that it is the flood in a river system like all our rivers during the monsoon, they tend to flood. Of course, in some years more than some others. So you can see the variability. You can see on the y-axis, you have river flow discharge in meter cube per second, or meter cube per day, or meter cube per month, whatever units. And on the x-axis, you have time. And what you have here is what is known as the hydrograph, which is basically the fundamental way in which hydrologists look at any flowing stream or river, is to look at the hydrograph. And so you can have an annual hydrograph, you can have hydrograph for a single rain event, or you can have a hydrograph for different months and so on. So this is across all those time scales. And all the organisms that live in the stream or river, they take their cues from either the rising limb or the falling limb. So basically their life history traits are linked to the cues that they get from the dynamics of the stream or discharge. So basically, if you are going to change the way in which a river or stream is going to flow in a very major way because of hydrological regulation, you are going to have problems with for many of these organisms which have co-evolved with the hydrologic cycle in the stream or river. Just one second. So this is just to show that the flood pulse is a very important source of not just disturbance, and of course it causes damage and so on, but it's a very fundamental part of the productivity of the river ecosystem. Because depending on the size of the flood, you have parts of the floodplain which get connected to the main river, like for example, oxbow lakes and so on, they get connected to the main river. It may not happen every year, but it may happen every 2 or 3 years or every 5 years and so on. So that's known as lateral connectivity. You have upstream to downstream connectivity, which is longitudinal connectivity. And then you have even when you have dry season, or even you have very dry years, there are certain types of changes that happen in the riparian vegetation. There are certain organisms which are able to take advantage of that. So it's basically the spatial and temporal heterogeneity and variability that the flood pulse creates is very important. The other part of the flood pulse concept is that earlier it was thought that when you have nutrients and fresh water and biota being brought from upstream to downstream, so what the floodplain simply does is it takes some fraction of that, maybe some local processing happens, and so they see the productivity of the floodplain and the river ecosystem was seen as some sort of function of what is coming from upstream in terms of the carbon coming in, the nitrogen coming in, the biomass, whatever else is coming in. However, based on the measurements and evidence that has now mounted over the last few decades, it turns out that the floodplain itself is a major generator of productivity, which is not necessarily explained by what is coming from upstream. So the linkage between the floodplain and the river is a very important part of the productivity. And so habitats such as this, where you have this connection between different parts of the floodplain and the river, provides a habitat for many endangered species, like this is the ghadial. You have the smooth coat otter, which is this is a picture I took in an island on the Ganga and the Vikramshila Dolphin Sanctuary. So these habitats are very important for biodiversity. And you can see this connection between the oxbow lakes and the floodplains. So whenever a river floods, the oxbow lake gets connected to the main channel. So there's exchange of nutrients, freshwater, sediments, and biota. And when that happens, there's an extra productivity generated in the floodplain and river linked system, which cannot be explained as simply as some fraction of what came from upstream. So this was a very paradigm shifting, and it was known as the flood pulse concept. And so that's why it's very important to maintain this connectivity between lateral as well as longitudinal. This is the Ganga. These are graphs made by my PhD student Nachiket, and you can see how dynamic the floodplain ecosystem is. You can see how the river has been shifting and moving around, and it is this changes over time and space that leads to the incredible productivity of some of these floodplain ecosystems, not necessarily just what is coming from upstream. The other aspect is that that the level of water or the discharge is a very important predictor of the productivity. As you can see, this is an example from the Mekong. So if you have these big floods, it generates a bounty for the fisher folk in terms of capture fisheries. So you require these floods. They're part of the ecological security of these river systems. Similarly, there is the evidence from India, from the Ganga, again from my PhD student Nachiket, who just presented this morning, and I am taken the liberty of borrowing one table from his PhD thesis, where we actually see that the aggregated fish yields and the catch per unit effort is a positive function of the river flow. So that's something that has emerged. This is the first type of evidence from India that's come. Then finally, all the water and sediment and nutrients that flow down the river, they end up in the sea, and they contribute to a huge amount of productivity of the coastal and marine ecosystems. So here you can see the mangrove ecosystem, which is in the Sundarbans, and we also have mangroves in the eastern coast, in the Krishna Delta. We have Bhitarkanika in Odisha. We have Pichavaram in Tamil Nadu. We have very nice mangroves in the west coast in Maharashtra as well. And the mangroves are some of the most productive ecosystems in terms of the amount of carbon that they can capture. For example, they can have as high as over 330 tons of carbon per hectare. And this is a function of the salinity zones. It's the amount of freshwater nutrients as well as the salinity. So apart from being a nursery for fish and also being an important, in some sense, shield against storms, they provide livelihoods and they provide ecological security to large parts of our coast and contribute to the very productive fisheries that we have in these areas. Now, extreme rainfall events are a consequence, are becoming a major source of concern. So this is just a schematic to show the distribution of extreme rainfall events from 1951 to 2007. And now we know that earlier we used to only have cyclones in the Bay of Bengal. Now we're beginning to have them in the Arabian Sea because of the warming of the Arabian Sea. We're going to have more cyclones coming and more extreme events. So apart from the Western Ghats, parts of central India, the Himalayas, you're also going to see a lot of coastal areas which are going to get impacted by extreme rainfall events. And here is a piece of work by Sonamani Das. This was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and where she showed that the number of deaths during the super cyclone in 1999 in Odisha declined when a village was in close proximity to a mangrove. So the further away, if you were from the shield of a mangrove, the more deaths that you actually had. So the size of the mangrove that protected the settlements played a big role in determining the mortality and damage due to that cyclone. And we know that we're going to have more cyclones on both the west coast and the east coast. So this is something that we need to think about, another dimension linking water security and ecological security. Now there was now all these rivers that flow into our seas and oceans, they take all the sediments and nutrients. And here you can see the chlorophyll A is concentrated along the river mouths. And this makes a huge difference to the productivity of our near coastal waters. So if we're talking about marine fisheries, they are to some extent dependent on the ecological role, ecosystem functions of rivers carrying tremendous amounts of freshwater sediments and nutrients into these near coastal waters. So what are the things that we can do? All this knowledge that's emerging, how can we act on it? How can it impact policy? So we know that in the last few decades, we have been losing some natural, of course, large, very active deforestation may have declined since the early 90s in many parts of the country, although it's continuing in some other places. But we are losing grasslands. And we are also seeing, for example, if you see the upper graph, that a lot of plantations are emerging as well. So since the early 1990s, tree plantations have been expanding in India at the rate of 15,400 square kilometers per year. Subtracting plantations from the total forest cover shows that native forests in India have been declining by 1.5% to 2.7% per year. So you have a decline in natural forests, you have an increase in tree plantations, and often many of these tree plantations are being planted on grasslands or open areas. So you can then think back to what we talked about in terms of extra evapotranspiration coming from trees being planted on grasslands. So that's one phenomena that we need to think about very carefully in our strategies for ecological restoration. Here is another piece of work that I was part of, where we looked at central India, where you have paddy fields, you have other types of agriculture. So you have rice paddy, you have other non-rice and common lands and pasture lands and so on. Then you have these two processes, evapotranspiration and you have groundwater recharge. And when you actually, if you wanted to grow, replace the tree, if you wanted to grow trees on rice paddies, now rice paddies have what is known as a depression storage, right? So they have the ability to store water. You lose that when you convert that into any other form of land cover or land use. So what came out of this piece of work was that if you wanted to plant trees in central India to increase, in terms of sequestering carbon, in terms of restoration, you should preferentially be planting it on areas which are not under paddy. And if you do that, you actually get an optimum forest cover or tree density, where you actually can have a good balance between groundwater recharge and evapotranspiration, and you will actually get a net positive impact. So that's the optimized scenario here, which is what we did. It was based on ground measurements as well as model. So I can share this piece of work, and it basically was a contribution to looking at India's targets on tree plantations and what type of strategies we should adopt to make sure that these negative trade-offs with respect to water security do not happen because of being very focused on just carbon. And also taking into account that even agro ecosystems such as rice paddies, they have a positive hydrologic role to play, and therefore you need to place your trees on or do your restoration or tree plantations and other types of land. Here is another evidence from the Gandak barrage, where we found that even if you just change the for an increase of just increase of 1,000 hectares change in the land cover in the catchment area. That is, there's a lot of sugarcane being grown here. If you take the sugarcane which is being grown here and you reduce that by just 10%, you are going to have additional 4 cubic meters of water flowing in the dry season in the Gandak River, which is ecologically significant. And this is it's a global biodiversity hotspot in terms of having the Gangetic river dolphins, the Gangetic gharials, endangered turtles, and so on. So this is a very important place of the part of the. I'm just going to shift here. There's a lot of disturbance. Okay, sorry about that. I have to limited space and a lot of people at home, 2 dogs as well. So here, so basically, if we even make very small to moderate changes in the use of water in agriculture, in our intensive agriculture, whether it's in wheat or in sugarcane and other water intensive crops, we can make a big difference to the ecological security of our rivers. Now, the other thing that we learned from our IPCC work is that whenever there is an increase in the amount, whenever there's new water being created, let's say that you save water in one sector, immediately there are demands for using that water in some sector or the other. So it doesn't, just because you change land use and land cover and you end up with extra water in the ground, in the groundwater or in the river, it's not necessarily that will happen, because sometimes people find new uses for the water. And so you need to have a policy that ensures that whatever water comes out of changes in land use and land cover ends up recharging our groundwater or contributing to our river flows. So that's basically one thing. And we need to take a look at all our major transformative hydrologic projects, hydrologic regulatory projects, the big dams, the barrages, the interlinking of rivers, the waterways, and look at them from the lens of, are they reducing the amount of sediment and nutrients in fresh water reaching the sea? Are they reducing the free-flowing stretches of the rivers? And therefore, that ecological cost needs to be taken into account when looking at some of these big transformations that are happening and are being planned. And we also need to have this linkage between ecological security and water security differs from one ecosystem, one socio-ecological system to another. It differs for a wetland, it differs for a river ecosystem, it differs for a mangrove, it differs for an area which is in semi-arid zone of India. And so you need to have a long-term information and engagement with the sites in terms of adaptive management. You need to have citizen science to play a very important role. And then you need to have informed participatory pilot restoration. You need, in some sense, a whole army of ecosystem restoration entrepreneurs who are going to be having the skills and the knowledge to restore very diverse types of degraded systems. And the scaling up of all of this through government, private sector, and NGO partnership and judiciary, media, all of that, these are perhaps one way in which we can actually reduce the trade-offs and increase the synergies between water security and ecological security. To conclude, this link between ecological security and water security is still not part of our policy or management discourse. For example, the impact of forests on rainfall, which is now emerging as from scientific work done by scientists abroad as well as in India, clearly shows that it's a new type of ecosystem service that needs to be taken into account. So your compensatory afforestation fund, even if you clear the best, most productive forest in India, you just need to pay for clearing that forest and diverting it for some project. The current CAMPA, the compensatory, all you need to do is to pay the amount that you would pay for a small 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of a medium-scale town in India. That's all you're paying for 1 hectare of the best ecosystem and all its ecosystem services. And when you take a cluster of linked ecosystems, such as the Central Indian Highlands, the Western Ghats, the Eastern Ghats, the Northeast India, or the Western Himalayas, their ecosystem services depends on the connectivity. That is how connected they are. So even the impact of forests on rainfall, for example, can break down if you actually have very disconnected set of patches, and all types of other processes happen. We also need to manage our upstream dams and barrages for ensuring downstream ecological flows. So we need a completely new way of managing them, including for sediment, releasing sediment downstream. And so these carbon targets that we have, very ambitious targets that India has, needs to be accomplished without hydrologic trade-offs. And we need to really look at all our large projects that reduce free-flowing rivers and try to retain as much of the mobility of fresh water and sediment to our seas and oceans. So that's basically where I end. And thank you for listening. And also sorry for some of the interruptions. I had to move around because of movement of family and family, friends, dogs, and so on. So.
Thank you so much, Jagdish. This is a lot of information and a lot of food for thought. And I mean, a lot of new information to me, particularly because I'm just entering the water field. So one question, I won't stand in between you and the audience, but just to give them a few minutes to gather their thoughts and, and sort of gather the questions that they might have. I wanted to ask you to just unpack the idea of ecological and water security a bit more for people who do not come from sciences background. Like how do ecologists or how do scientists look at ecological and water security, and what are the issues that directly link with the society in which there is a bit more critical rethinking required?
Yeah, so as I've been talking for some time now. There I showed two aspects of that. One was that the state of your vegetation, the type of vegetation that you have, has a big influence on the local hydrology. So that is the link between vegetative cover, and how much water you're going to have in the ground, how much water you're going to have flowing in the stream. So that is one aspect of it. And how, when you change that by either changing the composition of trees, by changing the density of trees, or by planting trees where they did not exist earlier, you could be changing that linkage between hydrology and the ecosystem in a very big way. So you might end up having less water security because of the way in which you manage your ecosystems. So that's one part. The second part is the role that water, free-flowing water in rivers and streams, and the sediment and nutrients that it conveys from one place to another, and the habitats that it generates along the way in the floodplains, that leads to very high levels of productivity, not just in the river ecosystems, but also when these rivers, they reach the seas and oceans, these are become hotspots for productivity of our marine ecosystems. So that is the other aspect that I talked about. And then this whole emerging evidence on how vegetation in India, what role it plays in impacting rainfall, because generally the paradigm we always had was that you have dense forests, you have evergreen forests where there's more rainfall, you have deciduous forests where there's slightly less rainfall, and so on. So that was rainfall and climate determining the vegetation. But the feedback from vegetation back into the monsoon system, that is that a vegetation itself is playing a very critical role in maintaining the dynamics of the monsoon. Now that's a pretty big deal. And if you want to include that and that's a very big part of ecological security that I think is understudied and underappreciated in the country. So that's basically what I wanted to say. And also that when we are going to achieve our carbon targets, because we want to sequester more carbon, we want to set aside large areas for fast growing trees. The choice of trees and the places where we put these trees is going to determine the trade-off, any negative trade-off with hydrology. So you might end up, if you do it the wrong way, you might end up with less water in your stream, less water in your groundwater, less soil moisture, and you can have other types of negative consequences. On the other hand, if you do it the right way, then you can actually have synergies between restoration, carbon targets, and hydrology.
Shalini, can I jump in here and quickly contribute a little point?
Yes, please.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jagdish, for that response. As an ecologist, in terms of ecological security, I quite often think of things independent of the water security bit, which is related to the question that you asked, Shalini. But Jagdish has a question to you in follow-up. Where are we in terms of understanding ecological security in terms of future climate change? And then proceeding from there to actually understand the feedbacks to water security.
Yeah, so I did show one graph, but I couldn't spend much time on it. So what's been happening to our monsoon since the 1950s is there's a decline in the overall monsoon, even though our climate models are predicting that monsoon should actually be increasing. So we have a low to moderate decline in the overall monsoon, and yet we have an increase in the frequency and intensity of extreme rain events. I mean, you folks know about what happened in Mumbai some years back. We had 950 millimeters of rainfall in a single day. A couple of years ago in Chennai, we had 225 millimeters, which is more than a month and a half of rainfall falling in 1.5 days in Chennai and neighbor areas. Now we're going to see more of that. Now we are seeing cyclones from the western sector, emerging from the Arabian Sea. So we have back-to-back cyclones now, one from the Arabian Sea, now one from the Bay of Bengal. Bay of Bengal was always a traditional area for cycloning, and that was based on geophysical and many aspects, so that is a separate issue. But now we are increasingly, because of climate change, we're going to see so we're going to have more extreme rain events. Now, some of the extremities that we are going to face from climate change might even overwhelm the some of our natural ecosystems. But some of them which are well functioning are going to play a positive role in mitigating the effects of these extreme rain events. Whether it's a mangrove ecosystem, it could be a riparian zone, it could be any a nice wetland, healthy wetland with storage capacity. These are all going to play a very important role in mitigating some of the negative impacts of these extreme rain events. So that's one aspect that, what is known as the disaster mitigation impacts, effects or outcomes of ecological restoration. So that is something that's an active area of work. We need to learn a lot more. And there are also limits. Simply saying that mangroves along the coast are going to save us from a lot of damage. I mean, that's also taking the bioshield argument a bit too far. But as you can see from that work done by Krishnawamy in Odisha during the super cyclone in 1999, mangroves did play a very important role. Similarly, there will be certain types of forests and certain types of vegetation, large patches of forests, which can play a very important role in the Western Himalayas in terms of reducing the impact of these extreme rain events on landslides and so on. So that, and evapotranspiration leads to drier soils, as you know. So when you have drier soils, they have a greater capability to absorb these extreme rain events to a certain amount. So actually, that's an additional role that will be brought into play when you have more extreme rainfall events happening, because you need higher levels of evapotranspiration on, say, steep hill slopes in order to keep the shallow soils reasonably dry, so that any additional moisture that comes into the system has a little bit more space to come in and not contribute directly to a devastating runoff. So these are things that we are still learning about. The sediment that the river is taking to our deltas, already you have sea level rise, plus you now have cyclones. If you don't have free flowing rivers, which is, and with their sediments, with sufficient amount of sediment contributing to our deltas and estuaries, feeding them from year to year, you're going to see a big erosion of our coastal areas and a big loss of many productive agroecosystems and natural ecosystems, including the mangroves, because they need sediment and fresh water to sustain them. So these are some of the things that I think that as you have changing climate, that is going to, and also we don't know enough. Your own work on the thermal tolerance of trees, and we don't know enough about, for example, how many tree species in India will be. There's a trade-off between if you shut, if a tree is too conservative, let's say that it shuts photosynthesis at the first instance of moisture stress. If it does it too often, then it's going to lose out in terms of capturing enough carbon to invest in leaves, buds, shoots, secondary compounds, and it might and which to stave off diseases and pests, and so many things will happen. On the other hand, if it is too liberal in keeping photosynthesis on, even when there is moisture stress, it runs the risk of cavitation and rupture of the xylem vessels and damage to tissues, and so you have that hydraulic failure so we don't know how many tree species in India, for example, are in following which strategy and how they're going to respond to some of these perturbations that we're going to see because of future climate change, both because of warming of the atmosphere, as well as the other aspects in terms of impacts on the rainfall extremities and so on.
Thank you, Jagdish. We now have a couple of questions from Shailaja Deshpande. I'll read it out for you. But in case if Shailaja wants to ask the question herself, Shailaja, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask the questions.
No, please, you ask.
Okay, all right. So her first question is, if the riparian zone has a canopy of trees, shrubs, lianas, and grasses, how does evapotranspiration balancing work? Second, if dams are built upstream, will floodplain dynamics about streams will work during floods? And the third question is, how barrages will impact the ecosystem of floodplains?
Yeah, so there's a lot of stuff. So I'll start with the first one before I forget what the first question was.
Yeah.
I think it was on riparian zones. So now
Yes.
riparian zones they exist because of the moisture that they have access to. So you have a very different, so even if when you go from the interior of a forest and you approach a stream, even if the stream is not flowing, you will see that the type of tree species that you have, jamuns and terminalias, many, and also the size of the trees, they are quite different because they have access to subsurface moisture. So in some sense, it's the proximity to water that creates the conditions for these riparian zones to exist. And they have a very big role to play in our carbon sequestration. So if you actually see some huge trees that you see along some of these streams and in the riparian zone, they have a very high amount of carbon. In fact, one large tree can account for the carbon, can store enough carbon compared to many, lots of other smaller and medium-sized trees. So individual trees, huge sized trees, old growth vegetation that you find along these riparian zones, they're hotspots, local hotspots of carbon storage. They're very important for biodiversity. There are certain bird species that you will find only in the riparian zone. The shade provided by the trees and the vegetation and the nutrient cycling role that they play in the stream when the stream is flowing or in the wetland leads to productivity of the system. So that is basically so I would just say that the riparian zones are not always tree dominated. You can even have grasslands, floodplain grasslands, and you have that diversity of riparian zones that we have is a good buffer, even for water quality. If you see many of the land use and upstream of the streams and wetlands, they release very high levels of agricultural runoff with high nutrients, contaminants. Now the buffer, this riparian zones, they play a very big role in filtering it out. It reduces the direct impact of many of these contaminants on the stream or river. It acts as a sort of a filter, and it assimilates some of these nutrients in the biomass itself. And so they plays that sort of a role. Of course, if you have too much of the nutrients and contaminants coming, they can get overwhelmed. But they play a very important role in ensuring that. So one aspect of water security that I did not explicitly mention is the quality of water. Now, the quality of water makes a big difference to how much you have to invest in using it for drinking. If you have highly contaminated water or polluted water coming out of a human-dominated ecosystem, you need to put in a lot of effort before it can become potable. Whereas if you have water coming out of a well-vegetated catchment with less disturbance and so on, you naturally are going to, with a good healthy riparian zone, you actually going to spend a lot less in terms of improving the water quality for various human uses, especially for drinking. So this is just one of the things that I wanted to mention for the riparian part. The second part, I think, was about I think it was
dams.
About dams.
If the dams are built upstream, will floodplain dynamics about streams be
impacted? Definitely, because dams, the first thing that dams do is trap sediments. So the fate of every reservoir is getting filled up. Sometimes they may take 50 years, sometimes they may take 60 years or 100 years. They get completely filled up and then they become unusable. They get filled up with sediment. And that's the sediment that accumulates behind the dam in what is known as the dead storage and so on. And then when it starts encroaching on live storage, then the dam becomes non-operational. So that is the sediment that is being, that the downstream ecosystem, riparian, as well as the river ecosystem is being deprived of. So that sediment should actually be mobilized and moving downstream and ultimately reaching our deltas and estuaries and seas and oceans. It doesn't. It accumulates behind these dams. So it's going to have a big impact on our floodplains. There's no doubt about that. Now, there are many of our Indian dams don't have lower level sluices. So we need to think of other ways in which certain types of initial high flows in the beginning of the monsoon maybe can be used for flushing the sediment out of some of these dams to keep the sediment going, to feed the sediment downstream so that the downstream ecosystems are not completely deprived of the high sediment flows that are required for maintaining the floodplain. So yes, that's a big. And the third question is about barrages. You just take the example of the Faraka barrage. had a huge impact on the ecology and the hydrology of the Ganga River. The Hilsa migration, for example, was a big casualty. And Hilsa, which used to go all the way hundreds of kilometers upstream, all the way up to Allahabad and so on, got, because of the Faraka barrage, that type of upstream migration, seasonal migration, is no longer possible. And so we need to, and then there's also been some evidence that a lot of sediment is accumulated behind the Faraka barrage, and that may be leading to higher susceptibility to floods in parts of Bihar. So that is something. And the other part I just want to mention about dams and barrage, dams especially, is that many of our disasters that have happened, whether it's the release of water from Bansagar Dam, or whether it's the release of water from some of the dams in Kerala, or the big floods in the Krishna that happened some years back, they have been attributed not to just because of we had heavy rain in the catchment. It was actually because of the way in which these dams are managed to maximize storage almost till the last minute when it's too late, and then you have to open all the gates and then you end up with So now there is a rethinking amongst the engineers about how you can actually have a safer way of managing a reservoir so that disastrous human-made floods don't occur. So that's basically, I think I've answered all the questions.
Yeah. Yes. So I'll now take a question from the YouTube audience. Pranita Mudaliar asks, what sort of impacts do small-scale projects such as farm, bunds, check dams have on overall stream flows at larger scales? Impact of small-scale projects, impacts of small-scale projects on larger scales of streams.
Yeah, so the work of, for example, my colleague Veena at A3, as well as work done by some of my students and colleagues on small dams in the Western Ghats. Actually, when you have a very large number of these structures, whether it's check dams or bunds or small dams, they can actually have a very big impact. In fact, there is some evidence that a cluster of small dams can actually have a more negative impact than one medium-sized dam in certain parts of the Western Ghats. So that's something that is emerging, because some of these small dams are located in the headwater parts of the Western Ghats, where you have endemic fish species and they're located in forested areas. So the disturbance and the fragmentation that results, as well as you also have this dewatered zone below a so-called mini hydro or micro hydro small dam. And so there's no water flowing for about a kilometer or more downstream of some of these so-called green energy projects. So they're not really green in that sense. And as I said, if you actually have a sufficient number of them, you can have an impact. And if you look at the work done by Veena and others in the Arkavati catchment, if you have lots of these structures, you can have a major impact on you can basically be reducing the amount of water that's going to end up reaching the stream or the river. So definitely small scale doesn't necessarily, it also depends on how widespread and how dense these structures are, and they could be impacting the catchment in a fairly major way.
The next question is from Aditi on Zoom. She says, she first thank you for this interesting talk and for your interesting research. She asks, how can development plans be extended beyond flood levels to include aspects like riparian vegetation?
Shalini, can you just repeat the last sentence? I missed out one
How
word.
can development plans be extended beyond flood levels to include aspects like riparian vegetation?
Flood levels, that's a part that I still haven't understood what is the meaning of beyond flood levels. But I'm assuming that we also, if you look at how we have been managing or we have been changing the land use in our floodplains, often there's a false sense of complacency because of certain types of hydrological regulation that works for some years. It could be a bund, or it could be some sort of other type of hydrologic structure, some river training works, whether it's in the Kosi system or in other rivers. Every 10 or 15 years, you will have a major event that will rip through that, and you actually you put large number of people who have now settled in a very vulnerable part of the floodplain. and they're exposed to devastating floods, loss of life and property. Now, ideally, you would want to have a very different type of economy and livelihoods linked to the knowledge that this is a very dynamic system, spatially as well as temporally. And so that requires a lot of imagination. It requires a lot of capacity building, where you don't think of floodplains as like any other place where you can just put up structures and buildings and infrastructure and treat them as very dynamic places. Just like now, because of the cyclones that are going to hit us regularly from Arabian Sea, which is not so often, decades ago, they were almost non-existent on the West Coast. We always had cyclones from the Bay of Bengal. Now we're going to have it from both. Now you need to think about what sort of infrastructure, what sort of development you have on the coast, so that people are not exposed to all sorts of, you saw the devastation that happened because of some rain events and other types of geophysical hazards in the Himalayas, where a lot of people working in a dam site, in the river channel, were killed, and all those tragic things happened. So increasingly, we need to think about what type of infrastructure can be resilient in terms of these massive perturbations that are going to occur because of climate change. And also look at a floodplain as a very dynamic system and see if you can think of livelihoods related to capture fisheries, related to our carbon targets, related to fishery, to other types of biomass production that doesn't expose a large number of people to the negative impacts of flooding.
The next question is from Manoj Mishra. He asked, with respect to emerging evidence, is there a case to rework water balance estimations at national and regional scales?
So the water balance is seldom done taking into account so if you really look at a Western Ghats catchment, from the Western Ghats going all the way up to the say the Deccan Plateau, or if you look at the Western Ghats rivers flowing to the west coast, or if you look at a river or a stream coming out of the Central Indian Highlands, that sort of water balance has to have a very big role in terms of the hydrologic functions performed by forests and vegetation. And we are just beginning to understand how much evapotranspiration values we need to give to different components of this. And so all the previous modeling has seldom has given attention to. They looked at forests as some sort of a single entity, or in some sense, very big bins. And we have a lot more diversity. The other part is this whole thing of feedback from vegetation back into the rainfall. That is not part of any of our estimation in terms of, when you're talking about compensation for a piece of forest which is being diverted in Central Indian Highlands or Western Ghats or Northeast India, how do you bring into the calculation the role that loss of that connectivity or fragmentation that is causing to a reduction in rainfall? It's a very tough thing to do because this is a very complex phenomenon. But we do know it exists. The evidence has now emerged. So you probably need to fix things in terms of saying that large clusters of forests are playing this role, and therefore they need to be, the last resort should be to disrupt the connectivity of the last remaining connected patches of forests. So we know that many of our forests are already fragmented. But if you look at what is left in the Central Indian Highlands, the Western Ghats, the Western Himalayas, Eastern Ghats, or in Northeast India, they need to be definitely placed at a premium, because we now know that they have a very important role to play even in our monsoon system. And that is not accounted for in the Finance Commission allocations to different states based on the baseline forest cover, or in the compensation that has to be paid by a project to divert forest land. All of this needs to, economists and ecologists, hydrologists need to really rework these numbers. And then when you look at the ecosystem services such as this, like monsoon, the productivity of our marine ecosystems, if all of that is added up, I think these decisions to go ahead with clearing of forests or diverting a river, reducing the amount of sediment reaching the sea, or reducing the amount of fresh water reaching the sea, this will turn out to be a net negative if you really do the numbers. But I think that we are grappling with methodology and with the complexity, and we really need to make headway together as between economists, ecologists, hydrologists, and bureaucrats. We really need to do this now, rework these numbers.
So the next question is from Ron Sunny. He's asking, under what circumstances is it okay to redirect a river to a water-deprived region? What ecological factors does one have to consider when planning river redirection?
Yeah, so the whole paradigm of river interlinking, it's actually not interlinking, it's actually diversion from one area to another. Because it's not like a digital link or road network or whatever. It's a very different phenomena, but it's still called interlinking. You are having the assumption that one area is water surplus and the other area is water deficient. Now, on two counts, this is flawed. One, the so-called surplus water is not as if it is of no use. It is performing some very useful functions in mobilizing and moving sediment downstream. The Cane River, for example, will reach the Yamuna, and then Yamuna will join with the Ganga, and so on. And so you actually have a continuity. When you take into account the role that the surplus water plays and all the functions it performs downstream, then you can't call it a surplus water that can be diverted. I'm not saying that you don't take any amount at all. All I'm saying is that you cannot have such huge quantities being called as surplus in one basin and being diverted to another area. So that's one. The second thing is that the so-called, even if you buy that argument of surplus and deficient basins, these are not carved in stone. Climate change is already going to be changing which areas are going to remain so-called surplus and which areas are going to remain so-called deficient. And even the areas which are currently being called surplus, they have severe water deficiency at a very local scale in parts of Bundelkhand. And so you need to, so river diversion, diverting an entire river should be the last resort after exhausting all other creative and nature-based solutions to improving water security at local and regional scales. And I'm not ruling out that some amount of diversion may happen, can be, but it should be after taking into account all the things that I've just mentioning and many other colleagues and scientists have raised.
So I'll now move towards the questions regarding knowledge politics. Ishita Jalan is asking, what are your thoughts regarding the role of citizen science and citizen participation for pushing the ecosystem service approach for reviving water ecosystems?
I think that the scientists just sitting in academic institutions or in universities, we are not sufficient in number or in strength or in our capacity to actually generate the evidence and data for such a complex network of ecosystems that we have across the country. So we need to really empower citizen science. Citizen science is emerging as a very powerful tool. And it is not that the quality of data, when you build the capacity, when you have good protocol, citizen science has been generating some wonderful scientific insights, for example, on bird migration, on many other changes in the phenology of vegetation, in how invasive species are spreading across the country. All of that citizen science has played a much bigger role than what all our funded projects from research institutions and government schemes and so on can do. So we really need to enhance citizen science in a very big way and make it an integral part of India's science policy, is to foster a large network of citizen scientists linked to government and research institutions and other private and public sector to generate large quantities of data in big campaigns simultaneously across the country so that you can actually make informed decisions on many things. Currently, if you're just going to be depending on certain funded projects and certain scientists and scientific institutions who have limited capacity and are constrained by their location or the time that they can give, we're not going to be able to capture the dynamics that are happening all across our ecosystems, which we really and the one other big advantage of empowered local citizen scientists is that they are stakeholders there. So they have much higher accountability to their own communities and in terms of generating the evidence and data. And also, I think, depending, as we have seen from the pandemic, and based on many other things related to for example, environmental impact assessment, we can't depend on certain institutions and consultancies and vested interests for generating high quality data and information on something as important as our ecological security. We really need to have a much more democratic and much more open system of generating the data and making it available in public domain, so that decisions that people are making, policymakers are making, will be much more accountable to the evidence that is there in either in favor of or against certain types of projects.
I think the next one is a related question, and part of it is already answered, but I'll read out the question anyway. Kalyani is asking, she says, my question is regarding environmental flow. The notion is paternalistic. What are your thoughts regarding improving this understanding about environmental flows, both at the policy level as well as at an individual level, for example, at the level of farmers?
Yeah, so ecological flow it can be defined at various spatial scales, and it is also a function of the normative goals that you set for yourself. So if you say that, for example, for the Ganga system, if you're worried about amount of nutrients and sediments reaching the Sundarbans or the coastal areas, then you need to work backwards to see what type of flow regimes are required. And often this also means that you need to have floods, certain types of floods to mobilize that. So that is at one scale. You also have in the dry season, often many of our rivers are literally running dry. They don't have even the quantities of water required to sustain many of the fisheries, or for that matter, aquatic biodiversity. So that requires us to manage our agriculture and other demands on water in a way that 10, 15, 20% gradually we start making available to downstream ecosystems the water that they are being deprived of. It will take some time, but that's another. So that dry season, you have one strategy. For the wet season, you have another strategy. And when you're talking about farmers are worried about soil moisture. They're worried about access to groundwater. So if you have ecological restoration that enhances recharge to groundwater, or the type of vegetation that reduces evapotranspiration in certain areas, so you try to avoid fast-growing tree plantations in certain types of semi-arid or subhumid areas, and you have also recharge areas which allows rainwater to infiltrate, and so this connect between ecological health and agricultural health is something that really requires a lot of attention. I think that's also something that has been neglected, and I know that in our watershed development schemes there was some emphasis on this, but a lot of the water that was saved, new uses were found for it, and it didn't end up contributing to, for example, enhanced stream flow that went all the way downstream to other communities and other ecosystems. So catch all the water where it falls can sometimes deprive an ecosystem downstream of the water. So you need to share water between upstream and downstream areas. And that paradigm needs to come into our watershed management, into our definition of ecological flow. It may mean very different things for a farmer in a semi-arid area, in a subhumid area, or for that matter, a floodplain farm. So that's basically what I would like to say on that.
Right. So I'll take just two more questions now, and then we can wind up. The next question is from Manikanta from Shivananda University. She's asking, can there be an alternative paradigm to a dam canal irrigation in agroecology?
So, we already have a large number of dams, canals, barrages. So any solution that we seek in the future has to take into account better management of our existing infrastructure. We can't do away with these immediately. So we need to manage these dams and barrages better. So because they are part of the problem, they can also become part of the solution to some extent. But any new areas in which we are thinking about having major hydrologic transformations, we need to think about other types of solutions, and these large-scale projects should be the last resort. So that is the twin strategy, is to improve the management of existing infrastructure, because many of them are underachieving. Many of our dams, barrages, and canal systems are not delivering what they were supposed to, whether it's in terms of irrigation potential, whether it's in terms of flood control, whether it's in terms of many other things, fisheries, or so on. So they're not meeting the promises that were made or the benefits that were touted. So we need to manage those better. And in newer areas, we think that's where we need to invest in, say, a wetland-based ecosystem service, or have agriculture that is dependent on ecosystem services of certain types of, whether it's a floodplain ecosystem, or whether it's a wetland, or whether it's a restored river. You can have new forms of livelihoods linked to that. Now, this requires very decentralized ways of interventions. And it doesn't mean that you don't have any civil engineering. You need to have in some sense, a very high sophisticated way of linking engineering with ecological engineering in some sense. And because, we are talking about highly polluted and highly degraded systems that need to be restored. And that itself can actually generate employment for a lot of people. And if you look at the net benefit that's going to come out of that, whether it's in terms of carbon, whether it's in terms of hydrology, whether it's in terms of jobs and livelihood security and biomass, I think you can have short-term and long-term goals along that may be able to compete with the existing paradigm of large-scale projects and diversion.
This is a question that is sent directly to me, but I think this is a question that a lot of us want to ask, but are too reluctant to put it forward in a gathering. I'll read out the question for you. Which ministries are involved in these processes, and how do you rate them in terms of responsiveness, commitment, interdepartmental cooperation, etc.? This might be a little, this might appear slightly off topic, but I would really like to know.
Yeah, it's a really difficult question for me. I know that, for example, if you take there is a ministry related to water, Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, all the Ganga schemes, these are all the ministries that are involved. You need to think about the ministries in charge of surface transport, river navigation, because they do involve certain perturbations and changes to our free-flowing rivers, perhaps converting many of our rivers into navigation canals, for example, that has ecological impacts and other things. So there are definitely about, I would say, if you take any ministry that involves either the consumption of water, a new demand for water, or it is involved in fragmenting a forest in one way or the other, I would say all ministries are involved in that scene. But these 4 to 5 ministries tend to have a bigger role in some of the immediate things related to rivers and forests. So Ministry of Water Resources, Irrigation, Power, Renewable Energy. You have so these are, and then of course Environment, Forest and Climate Change. So these are the obvious ones. But I would say that if you take projects of any ministry, they need to look at the ecological and hydrologic trade-offs when they are planning those projects, so that either they can redesign them or avoid them in certain areas, or you build a very safe, you build mitigation, take mitigation measures or invest in mitigation infrastructure, so that ecological connectivity or hydrologic disruption is minimized. So I would say that this type of cooperation and looking at things together, all dimensions of a project, is not happening currently. And I think it needs to, it definitely needs to happen. I don't think that it's happening to the extent that we would like, and maybe it's not happening at all in some places. Karnataka, for example, in last year's budget, before the pandemic came in, had come in with the green index, which basically said that all projects by any ministry in Karnataka will be looked through a green lens in terms of its impacts. So that is actually a very good way of linking different ministries and departments. I don't know to what extent that green index is going to be implemented and how it's going to be implemented, who all will be contributing to that, looking at the indices and making decisions. But it was a thought in the right direction. I hope that we can have some of that at the national level and in all the states.
Thank you so much, Jagdish. I think, I know that we had actually reserved 15 to 20 minutes for the questions, but it's almost like 45 minutes that you've been answering the questions. Thank you so much for engaging at such length and with your generosity in terms of sharing these insights and incredible work. I now would invite my colleague Deepak to please give concluding remarks and also a vote of thanks on behalf of everyone here.
Thanks, Shalini. I'm going to keep this quick, given that we've already gone more than 40 minutes over time. But thanks again, Jagdish. Wonderful talk. And I think the extended question and answers is a good sign of a wonderful talk. There have been lots of very, very positive comments in the chat box. I think for me, Jagdish, what you did very nicely is making this link between ecological and hydrological security, tying together this very complex area, which involves, a lot of academic research, a lot of applied conservation work, etc. Right, going from agriculture to fisheries and livelihoods, etc. So I'm just going to say thanks again a lot, Jagdish, for this wonderful talk. I forgot to mention this earlier. I wanted to say this in the beginning when I introduced you, but we're also very lucky to have Jagdish in our board of directors in the Center for Water Research. So thanks a lot, Jagdish.
Thanks, Deepak, and thanks everybody for being patient and being part of this. And I think that this is work in progress for all of us. And I really like to thank Shalini, Vijay, Sarah, and everybody else involved in making this center and this opportunity to talk. Thank you. Everybody be safe.
Thank you.